The StuG III wasn't just another armored vehicle, it was Germany's workhorse of World War II. The most produced armored fighting machine of the entire conflict. Compact, low to the ground, and built for one purpose: destruction. This squat, deadly beast stalked every battlefield, across the frozen wastelands of Russia, the scorching deserts of North Africa, and the tangled hedgerows of Normandy. And here's the shocking part. The StuG III destroyed more tanks than the legendary Tiger and Panther combined. By the spring of 1944, German crews claimed over 20,000 enemy tanks, a staggering figure for a vehicle that wasn't even classified as a tank. Why was it so effective? Cost and simplicity. For every Tiger that rolled out of the factory, Germany could produce 7 StuGs. That made it the backbone of the Wehrmacht's anti-tank forces in the blood-soaked final years of the war. But here's the dark twist in the StuG's legacy, a chilling paradox that few talk about. Behind its fearsome reputation lurks a statistic that would terrify any soldier. 80% of StuG III crew members didn't survive the war, killed, wounded, or captured. Almost every man who climbed into its steel belly paid the ultimate price. For the 4 men packed inside that cramped metal coffin, this tank destroyer wasn't just a weapon, it was a gamble with death. So, how could a vehicle so brutally effective against the enemy turn into a death trap for its own crew? What made the StuG both a hero of the battlefield and a harbinger of doom for the men who served it? The truth isn't simple. It's a story of design compromises, of a machine forced into roles it was never built for, and of the relentless chaos of a collapsing front. This is the grim reality behind one of World War II's deadliest paradoxes. Why the StuG III killed so many of the men who fought inside it. To understand why the StuG became both a battlefield legend and a death trap, we need to go back to its roots. And surprisingly, its story doesn't start with tanks, it starts with infantry. The idea behind the Sturmgeschütz, or assault gun, was born from the brutal lessons of World War I. Back then, infantry attacks often crumbled under the weight of entrenched machine guns and heavy artillery. Fast forward to 1933. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party seize power with an ambitious vision: Lebensraum, living space. Hitler's plan was clear: expand German territory to create room for a growing Aryan population. At first, it seemed like bloodless conquest was possible. Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the Memel region fell into the Reich without a fight. But that illusion shattered in September 1939, when German troops stormed across the Polish border. Europe was at war again, and this time, combat would look nothing like the muddy stalemates of 1914 to 1918. The era of trench warfare was over. Hitler had seen the horrors of trench warfare in World War I. He knew what it was like: mud everywhere, barbed wire, and soldiers stuck in a never-ending fight. Other German generals like Erich von Manstein also remembered those terrible battles. They agreed on one thing: if Germany went to war again, soldiers couldn't just run across open ground and get shot down. They needed a better way to fight, something that could move with the troops and break through enemy lines. Old-style towed artillery wasn't good enough. It was too slow, hard to move, and the soldiers using it were easy targets. So, they came up with a new idea: a gun that was protected by armor, could move on its own, and follow the soldiers into battle. It could take hits from small guns and destroy enemy bunkers and machine gun positions before they wiped out the infantry. This wasn't just another tank. It was like a giant battering ram for modern warfare. And that's how Germany's assault gun, the Sturmgeschütz, was born. But what no one expected was this: the very machine built to protect soldiers would become one of the most dangerous places for a German soldier to be. But not everyone liked the idea right away. In fact, it got caught up in German military politics. The Panzerwaffe, Germany's elite tank force, led by generals like Heinz Guderian, wanted nothing to do with it. They were focused on speed and powerful attacks, breaking through enemy lines fast and deep. To them, a slow-moving support gun for infantry just seemed like a waste. Why use valuable tank parts to build something that couldn't help with their fast attacks? So, the tank generals pushed the idea aside. And since the infantry didn't have the power or resources to build it themselves, the project ended up, almost by accident, in the hands of the artillery branch. That unexpected move would change everything. The StuG, which started as a simple tool to help foot soldiers, would go on to become a legend on the battlefield, and sadly, a death trap for thousands of its crew. You see, the StuG wasn't really a tank. It was an artillery gun on tracks, and the men who operated it were trained as artillerymen, not tank drivers. They knew how to calculate distance, angles, and deliver accurate shots from far away. These skills would later make them some of the best long-range tank hunters in the war. But there was a big problem. The StuG wasn't built for close combat. It didn't have a rotating turret. Its armor was weak on the sides and back. It wasn't made to fight in fast, close-up battles like real tanks were. By 1936, the idea finally moved forward. The German military gave the contract to Daimler-Benz, and the instructions were clear but ambitious. They had to build the new vehicle using the Panzer III tank as a base. It needed a 7.5-centimeter gun that could move only a little from side to side. Most importantly, it had to be very low, shorter than a standing soldier, so it would be hard to spot and hard to hit. The result came out in 1940, the StuG III AUSF. It was small, low, and deadly in its role. The short-barreled 7.5-centimeter gun wasn't meant to fight enemy tanks. Instead, it fired high-explosive shells that could destroy bunkers, machine gun nests, and enemy fortifications. And for that job, it was perfect. At this point in the war, the StuG wasn't built to fight tanks. That would come later, when the war changed, and so did the StuG's role. When Germany invaded France in 1940, the first StuG units went into battle, and they were a success. They did exactly what they were made to do: break through strong defenses, help the infantry advance, and keep the fast-moving blitzkrieg attack going. Crews quickly fell in love with one feature above all: the StuG's incredibly low profile. Standing just over 2 meters tall, it was a ghost on the battlefield, easy to hide, hard to hit. This made it a natural ambusher, a quality that would later define its deadliest role. In those early days, the StuG seemed like the perfect weapon: efficient, precise, and purpose-built. But hidden beneath that success were the compromises baked into its design, compromises that would one day turn it into a death trap. Because the StuG was created for a very specific type of war: fast-moving offensives, smashing bunkers, supporting infantry. But Germany was about to lose the initiative. And when the tide turned, the StuG would be forced into a brutal new role, one it was never meant to play. Every armored fighting vehicle is a balancing act, a constant trade-off between firepower, mobility, and protection. Boost one, and you almost always weaken the others. The StuG III embodied this principle more than almost any vehicle of its time. It wasn't a flawed design. Far from it. It was a brilliant solution for a specific problem. But those same design choices, so logical in 1940, would become lethal weaknesses as the war dragged on. From the start, the StuG was all about speed of production and specialization. It wasn't a tank. It was an assault gun, a low, compact platform meant to follow infantry, blow apart bunkers, and keep the attack rolling. That meant a fixed gun instead of a turret, light armor on the sides and rear, and a profile so low it could practically disappear behind a hedge. In its original role, those trade-offs made sense, but as Germany's fortunes shifted and the StuG was pushed into a new role, hunting enemy tanks head-on, those compromises would turn the battlefield into a slaughterhouse for its crews. The most important design choice for the StuG was this: it didn't have a turret. Instead of using the rotating turret from the Panzer III, the Germans built a fixed, box-shaped top called a casemate. This decision helped them in a few major ways. First, it made the StuG much cheaper. A Panzer IV cost about 100,000 Reichsmarks, but a StuG III cost only around 82,500. Second, it sped up production. And in a war where numbers meant survival, that really mattered. The result? Germany was able to build huge numbers of StuGs. By the end of the war, about 10,500 StuG IIIs and their close cousins, the StuG 42, had been made. That made it the most produced German armored vehicle in the entire war. But this low cost came with a big downside. Because the gun didn't move much from side to side, only 12 degrees in each direction, the crew had a major challenge. If they wanted to aim at something outside that small range, they had to turn the entire 24-ton vehicle just to line up the shot. In an ambush, the StuG's fixed gun wasn't a problem. It could stay hidden, aim carefully, and take out targets from cover. But in a fast, chaotic tank battle, that same design became a serious danger. If an enemy tank came from the side, which happened often, the StuG was in big trouble. For many StuG crews, that design flaw cost them their lives. Picture this. A StuG crew is focused on a tank right in front of them. They're aiming, loading, firing. Then, another enemy tank suddenly shows up from the side. In a tank like a Panzer or a Sherman, that wouldn't be a big problem. You'd just spin the turret, fire, and take it out. But in a StuG, there was no turret. The commander had to yell to the driver to stop, turn the whole vehicle, and try to aim using the narrow front gun. All of this while enemy shells were already flying in. Those few seconds, they were often deadly, and even if the StuG managed to turn in time, its sides and rear had very thin armor, easy for enemy shots to punch through. That made flank attacks especially dangerous. On paper, the later version of the StuG III, the OSFG, looked strong. It had thick front armor, up to 80 millimeters, which could stop many Allied shells head-on. But that strength was misleading. The sides, only 30 millimeters thick, about the same as a metal door. The back was even weaker. Against tanks like the Sherman or the T-34, one hit to the side was usually fatal. The results were horrific: fires, exploding shells, and crews torn apart inside their metal coffin. So while the StuG was great in front-facing ambushes, it became deadly for its own crew the moment the battle started moving. On the Eastern Front, where battles were fast and unpredictable, getting flanked wasn't just a risk, it was almost certain. And as bad as the armor was, the inside of the StuG made things even worse. The four-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, and driver, were packed tightly together in one small steel box. There were no walls or barriers between them, so if a shell hit the side, it tore through everything and everyone in its path. Shrapnel, fire, exploding ammo, one hit could wipe out the entire crew in seconds. The Germans tried to improve the StuG's weak points. Later in the war, they added Schürzen, thin steel plates attached to the sides. These were meant to stop certain anti-tank weapons like bazookas or Soviet rifles, and they helped a little. But they didn't fix the real problem. The main side armor underneath was still too thin. Then there was the roof, just 10 to 16 millimeters thick. That's barely anything. So the StuG wasn't just in danger from tanks and ground weapons. Airplanes could rip it apart with machine guns and cannons. Even enemy soldiers firing from rooftops during city battles could destroy it from above. In simple terms, the StuG was powerful, but only from the front. If enemies got behind it, above it, or too close, it became extremely vulnerable. And in the final years of the war, that's exactly what was happening every day. All of this was the result of design trade-offs. The fixed gun, it saved money and made production faster. The thick front armor, it helped in frontal assaults, but left the sides exposed. The low profile made it harder to spot, but also made it harder for the crew to see around them. In 1940, these were smart choices for a vehicle meant to help infantry. But by 1943, the war had changed. The StuG wasn't just taking out bunkers anymore, it was being thrown into chaotic tank battles, surrounded by enemies. And those early compromises? They didn't just cause problems, they got people killed. Every shortcut in the design came with a deadly cost. Inside every StuG were 4 men, squeezed into a space barely bigger than a small car. Each had a crucial job. The driver had to control a 24-ton machine, often while under fire. The gunner aimed and fired the main gun. His speed and accuracy could mean life or death. The loader worked fast, shoving heavy shells into the gun, racing against time, and the commander was in charge, watching, giving orders, spotting threats, and hoping they could react fast enough. But it wasn't just about doing your own job. In battle, if one crew member was killed or injured, and that happened often, someone else had to take over immediately. To survive, each man had to be flexible and know how to do every job. Even outside of combat, the danger didn't go away. If the StuG broke down, and it often did, the crew had to repair it themselves. If they couldn't, they risked being left behind in enemy territory. StuG crews weren't regular tank soldiers. They were artillerymen, and their uniforms showed it. Grey wraparound jackets with red stripes, army rank symbols on the collars, grey wool pants, grey shirts, and black boots. They might have looked sharp during training, but inside the StuG, those uniforms were quickly soaked with sweat, covered in oil, and stained with blood. Life in a StuG wasn't heroic or clean. It was cramped, dirty, and terrifying. Every mission felt like flipping a coin. Would they survive or go up in flames? The StuG crew had their own special look. Their uniform included a short wraparound jacket, tightened at the waist with a black leather belt. On the buckle was the standard Wehrmacht symbol, an eagle holding a swastika above the words "Gott mit uns," God with us. If a StuG crew became part of a Panzer tank unit, they often made a small but meaningful change. They swapped their red collar trim for pink, the color of the Panzer troops. It was a quiet way of showing they were part of the armored elite. But once the shooting started, uniforms didn't matter, survival did. StuG crews carried pistols like the P-38 or Luger and short machine guns like the MP-40 in case they had to fight outside the vehicle. Rifles weren't practical. There simply wasn't room for them inside the tight space. In everyday life inside the StuG, comfort and practicality came first. The sharp uniforms were replaced with dirty, oil-stained coveralls that were easier to move in during long and exhausting missions. Because life inside a StuG was anything but glamorous. It was boiling hot, filled with smoke and fuel fumes, deafening from the constant noise and always smelling like gunpowder. For many crews, it was more than just a combat vehicle. It was their home, and too often their grave. The StuG wasn't originally meant to be a tank killer. That role came later, out of desperation. It started in the summer of 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. At first, everything went according to plan. The German blitzkrieg was unstoppable. But then, they ran into a problem they never expected: the Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks. The T-34 changed everything. Its sloped armor could bounce off German shells, and its powerful 76mm gun was stronger than almost anything the Germans had. The KV-1 was even tougher, like a steel fortress on tracks. Suddenly, Germany's famous Panzer divisions were no longer the strongest on the battlefield, and the StuG III, it was in trouble. Its short 7.5cm gun, great for blowing up bunkers, couldn't do much against a T-34. It was simply too weak. Germany needed a fix, and fast. They didn't have time to build a brand new tank from scratch, so they looked at what they already had, the StuG III. It had strong front armor, a low profile, and was quick to build. If they could just give it a more powerful gun, maybe it could stand a chance. That's when the StuG began to change, from a simple support weapon into one of Germany's deadliest tank hunters. The StuG III was the perfect machine for an upgrade. It used the strong and reliable Panzer III base, which made it sturdy, easy to build, and flexible. Then, in early 1942, everything changed. Germany introduced the StuG III AUSF, now armed with a long-barreled 7.5cm StuK-40 gun. This new high-velocity cannon gave the StuG the power to destroy enemy tanks. That one upgrade completely changed the StuG's role. It was no longer just good at blowing up bunkers. It could now take out enemy tanks. Later versions even got the same powerful gun used on upgraded Panzer IVs. With that kind of firepower, the StuG could destroy T-34s, KV-1s, and even American Shermans at normal combat distances. And with that change, its mission shifted too. The StuG was no longer just helping infantry. It became one of Germany's most important anti-tank weapons, especially on the Eastern Front. The wide open land there was perfect for ambushes. In those conditions, the StuG became a deadly hunter. Its low shape let it hide easily, behind buildings, in forests, or in shallow holes. Soviet tank units often drove straight into ambushes, unaware they were in danger, until the StuGs opened fire. The StuG crews, trained as artillerymen, were perfect for this new job. They weren't just tank hunters, they were like snipers on tracks. Calm, patient, and deadly accurate, they waited in hiding, using Germany's excellent optics to search for targets. When enemy tanks rolled into areas they had already aimed at, the StuGs fired with deadly precision. One shot, one kill. Then, before the enemy could hit back, the crew would throw the StuG into reverse, disappear behind cover, and move to a new hiding spot. These shoot-and-scoot tactics made the StuG a nightmare for Allied tanks and gave the crew their best chance to stay alive. The results were shocking. During the massive Battle of Kursk in 1943, StuG units destroyed far more tanks than they lost, impressing even German commanders. By late 1944, StuG crews had claimed the destruction of around 20,000 enemy tanks, even the famous Panther or Tiger tanks. But this success came with a dangerous downside. Because the StuG was doing so well, German generals started using it in ways it was never meant for, close-up, chaotic battles where tanks fought at point-blank range. In those situations, the StuG's fixed gun and weak side armor became serious problems. The StuG was brilliant at one thing: long-range ambushes. But World War II was turning into a messy, brutal fight that demanded flexibility and all-around defense. And the StuG wasn't made for that kind of war. Its crews were brave, but many would pay the price for the machine's limits. That shocking 80% casualty rate didn't come during the early successful years of the StuG. It came during the final, terrible phase of the war, between 1943 and 1945. By then, everything had changed. Germany wasn't winning anymore. It was retreating, losing ground on all sides. And in this new kind of war, the StuG III, once a powerful weapon, was now being used like a sacrificial piece. The main reason so many StuG crews died wasn't because of bad design or poor training. It was because of numbers. The Allies had more of everything: more tanks, more planes, more soldiers. By the end of the war, for every StuG or German tank, there might be 5, 10, or even 20 enemy vehicles. Yes, a skilled StuG crew could hide and destroy several enemy tanks in one battle, maybe 3, 4, or even 5. But there was always another one coming. And if just one of those enemies got a shot at the StuG's thin side armor, that was it. Game over. By this point, survival wasn't about clever tactics or experience. It came down to cold, hard math. And in that kind of war, math showed no mercy. As Germany's front lines collapsed, StuG units were turned into fire brigades, called Feuerwehren in German. Their job was to race from one crisis to the next, filling holes in the defense, covering retreats, and sometimes even being ordered to launch hopeless counterattacks. They were sent straight into the worst parts of the battlefield, often with no infantry backup, no air support, and no chance of help. The orders were simple and brutal: hold the line, or die trying. For many crews, that meant fighting until their StuG ran out of fuel, ran out of ammo, or was destroyed in flames. The losses were massive. Out of the 10,500 StuG IIIs and StuG 42s built during the war, only about 1,330 were still working by April 1945. The rest were either destroyed, captured, or left behind in the mud and rubble of a dying Germany. The human cost was just as terrible. The well-trained, experienced crews who had once made the StuG such a deadly weapon were gone, killed or badly wounded. In their place were new, barely trained soldiers, rushed into battle with little time to even learn how the machine worked. The difference was obvious. Veteran crews knew how to spot danger, predict ambushes, and escape in time. But new recruits often didn't see the enemy until it was too late, until a shell tore through their thin armor, and by then it was over. In the final months of the war, the StuG was no longer a symbol of German strength or smart engineering. It had become a last-ditch weapon, crewed by boys and old men, fighting in machines that had become steel coffins, in a war that was already lost. What made things even worse for StuG crews was the collapse of Germany's supply system. The StuG was a deadly ambush weapon, but without fuel, it was just a 24-ton steel coffin stuck in the mud. As Allied bombers destroyed railways, roads, and fuel depots, supplies became almost impossible to get. Fuel and shells were more valuable than gold. Because of this, many StuGs weren't destroyed in big battles. They were simply abandoned when they ran out of fuel. The crews had no choice. They had to destroy their own vehicles, set them on fire so the enemy couldn't use them, and then start walking, often straight into enemy territory. For many, that walk turned into a death march they never came back from. In the end, the StuG was a weapon built from compromises. It was a smart, low-cost design that became the most produced armored vehicle in Germany's army. It was great at what it was made for: defensive, careful warfare. And for a time, it did that job well. But in the final months of the war, as Germany collapsed, the StuG was used in battles it wasn't built for. It became a desperate, last-minute solution in a war that was already lost. And for the men trapped inside it, that meant one final truth. The StuG had gone from hunter to coffin. Jan Zysker's story didn't begin on a battlefield. It started in the peaceful hills of the Sudetenland in what was then Czechoslovakia. Born in 1914, Jan grew up with a deep love for anything mechanical. As a young boy, he even built a working radio inside a doll box, which amazed his whole village. By 1938, Jan had finished 8 years of tough training and become a skilled machinist. But that same year, everything changed. Nazi Germany took over his homeland, and Jan's future was now tied to Hitler's war machine. Still, Jan stayed true to his passion. He loved engines. So when he got the chance, he joined the Nazi Vehicle Corps, where he was suddenly surrounded by machines he had only dreamed about. Motorcycles, trucks, and cars, luxuries he never had before. What Jan didn't know was that his skills would eventually land him inside one of the deadliest armored vehicles of the war, the StuG III. Unlike many others, Jan survived the war. He didn't die in a burning tank or disappear on the battlefield, but his survival came at a cost, a deep, lasting toll that few of us today could ever fully understand. Not long after World War II began in 1939, Jan Zysker was drafted into the German army. Because of his skill with machines, he was assigned to a StuG III unit, and before long, he was inside the steel walls of one of Germany's deadliest armored vehicles. By 1941, Jan and his crew were fighting on the Eastern Front, deep in the vast frozen lands of the Soviet Union. For years, they endured some of the worst conditions imaginable: freezing blizzards, endless mud, and constant Soviet attacks. Somehow they survived wave after wave of brutal battles, even as Nazi Germany's dreams of victory fell apart around them. Then came late 1944. The front was breaking. There was no fuel, no ammunition, and no hope. Their StuG could barely move. Ordered to cover a retreat, the crew had a terrible decision to make: stay and be captured, or destroy the machine that had kept them alive for so long. They made their choice. With the Soviet army closing in, they drove their beloved StuG onto a frozen river and sank it beneath the ice. They would not let it fall into enemy hands. After that, they tried to escape on foot, hoping to reach German lines. But fate had other plans. They ran straight into a Soviet patrol, and in the gunfire that followed, every one of Jan's crewmates was killed. Jan was the only one who survived, driven by instinct and pure willpower. After the battle, he dragged himself under the broken remains of a building and lay perfectly still while Soviet soldiers searched the area. They never saw him. Hours later, when everything was quiet, Jan crawled out and began a desperate journey through enemy territory. For weeks, he moved like a shadow, stealing food, hiding wherever he could, and depending on the kindness of local civilians who dared to help. Somehow, against all odds, Jan Zysker made it home, back to his wife, back to safety, and back to a life after the war. A life that so few StuG crewmen ever lived long enough to see. Back in Tusit, Jan didn't return to the war. Instead, he went into hiding, hoping the war would end before anyone found him. But his luck didn't last. Local Nazi officials discovered him, dragged him into a house, tied him to a chair, and beat him badly. But then came a moment of courage. Goethe, his young wife, risked everything. While the guards were gone, she sneaked into the room, untied Jan, and helped him escape, saving his life. As the war came to an end and the Soviets took over Tusit, Jan fled west. Goethe followed later, carrying their newborn son. The small family eventually reunited, but they had nowhere to go. They ended up in a displaced persons camp near Frankfurt, Germany. For 3 hard years, they lived in tough conditions, but still managed to welcome a second child, all while waiting for a chance to start over. That chance finally came. A sponsor in the United States helped them emigrate. The Zysker family moved to America, worked hard, and slowly built a new life. They raised 3 children, started from nothing, and, against all odds, found peace after surviving the horrors of war. Here's the strange twist. After the war, Jan became a much-loved member of his new American hometown. In his free time, he played the accordion at local dance halls, often in front of the very same US veterans he had once fought against, along with their wives. His story is rare because for thousands of other StuG crewmen, the war didn't end in peace. The StuG wasn't their way home. It was their coffin. So why did the StuG III gain such a terrible reputation for killing its own crews? The answer lies in a tragic mix of design choices and how the war changed. From the start, the StuG was built as a tool for infantry support. It didn't have a turret. Its side armor was thin. Its inside was tight and cramped. But none of that was by accident. Those were intentional trade-offs. The goal was to make the StuG cheap, fast to build, and perfect for destroying enemy bunkers and strongpoints. But as the war turned against Germany, the StuG was no longer helping infantry advance. It became Germany's main tank killer, forced into the front lines of a losing war. In this new role, it became a lethal ambush weapon. Its low profile made it easy to hide, and its powerful gun could destroy Allied tanks from a distance with deadly accuracy. But this shift in role would soon come at a terrible cost. And that was the sad irony. The StuG was so effective at its job that commanders started using it everywhere, in every collapsing front, every desperate last stand. It became the Wehrmacht's emergency response unit, racing from one disaster to the next, always outnumbered, often surrounded and constantly under fire. But the very features that made the StuG strong at first became deadly weaknesses later on. No turret meant it couldn't turn quickly to face enemies from the side. Thin side and roof armor meant one well-aimed shot could destroy it. And inside, with 4 men packed closely together, a single hit often meant all of them died. In the end, the StuG was both brilliant and doomed, a clever design that was pushed too far. It started as a precise infantry support weapon, but turned into a disposable backup in a war Germany was losing. And the brave men who crewed it paid the ultimate price. Its flaws, once manageable, were now exposed in the chaos of late war fighting. The fixed gun made it slow to respond. The thin armor left it open to attack from almost any direction. And the tight interior meant one hit could wipe out the whole crew. Add in poor training, broken supply lines, and the massive numbers of enemy tanks, and the result was clear. A weapon with a sky-high casualty rate and a legacy written in blood. The legacy of the StuG III is a paradox. On paper, it was one of the most cost-effective and successful armored vehicles of World War II. But in reality, it became a steel coffin for thousands of men. A stark reminder that the true measure of a weapon isn't just its kill count, but its ability to bring its crew home. And in that final, brutal test, the StuG III failed. This story is a sobering lesson. The cold statistics of war, production numbers, kill ratios, never tell the whole truth. Behind every machine are human lives, often sacrificed to the very efficiency that makes a weapon famous. If you found this deep dive into the StuG III compelling, subscribe to the channel. We explore the hidden stories behind history's most iconic machines every week. And now, we want to hear from you. What other so-called successful weapons hid a deadly cost for their crews? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.